Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I had a lot of fun when I was a teenager, but one of my great regrets was that I did not play enough Dungeons and Dragons. And this was not out of a lack of interest. I was a fantasy head. I loved Tolkien. I loved Michael Moorcock. I was super into Conan the Barbarian, and I was ready to play. I just didn't quite find the friends who were at the right stage in their own evolution to hook up to really play a long campaign, though I did play a number of times and quite enjoyed it. I think in some ways it was because I was having a little bit too much fun in high school, where my crew sort of had our own adventures starting around age 12, 13, where it was entertaining enough to go out and wage our own campaigns on the peculiar landscape of Southern California suburbia. Say no more about that. But D&D stayed with me as a really important figure for how the imagination, in the full, almost sacred sense of the term, can get mixed up with popular culture, and indeed the works of fiction and the imagination as a kind of entertainment media. And later on, when I was first getting online, I got really into MUDs and moos. And it was very interesting because you could see then how some of the D&D logic, the sort of world-building, role-playing gaming, war-gaming aspect, was leaking into the Internet before it was a particularly visual medium. So this was all in text back in the day. Yes, I have a gray beard. And it was fascinating, and it was a real interesting split, because when you'd go onto these worlds, there were some that were really devoted to what they called hack and slash, where there was just a lot of monster killing, and you'd get attacked the minute you'd pop into the world. And then there were some that grew up that were much more social, and indeed were no longer really game worlds. They were more like Second Life. Lambda Moo was a famous one in this regards, and I spent a lot more time there because I was sort of more of a literary sort, in love with language more than leveling up, as they say. And then when I came to write Technosis in the late 90s, D&D played a really important role, because one of the things I was tracing was how the imagination of magic and the occult leaked into the computer. You already have gaming starting with Space War in I think it's the early 60s, mid-60s when that gets going. It gets spread around the research community. So there's already a kind of a gaming space within the computer before D&D inspired role-playing gaming and fantasy role-playing gaming got into the guts of the machine. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about D&D and the way that it combines rules of procedure with the work of the human imagination, both from the dungeon master's side in terms of creating a scenario and loading it with little jewels and Easter eggs and traps and tricks, and then the imaginative work of the players as they kind of collectively go through their minds, even as they're sitting around a table drinking Coca-Cola, eating chips, rolling little peculiar dice, which themselves have a strangely occult air to them. So in any case, I've been continuously interested in role-playing gaming, even if I'm not much of a gamer myself. And I was very happy to hear the news about the success of the recent 5th edition of D&D. The D&D Player's Handbook came out not too long ago, and to great acclaim. And it sounds like they really have decided to revise the enterprise and make it a little more streamlined, more centered on role play. And people seem to like it a great deal, and it sort of warms the cockles of my heart that such an OG, original gangster kind of gaming can thrive in the area of Oculus Rift. And so when a friend of mine told me that he was good friends with Jeremy Crawford, who was who's a lead designer and a managing editor at Wizards of the Coast, the folks behind D&D, and that he was one of the 2 lead designers on the 5th edition, I was like, okay, I got to talk to this guy. So I'm really psyched that Jeremy is able to join us here on Expanding Minds. So Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. You know, I think I just want to start out with a little snapshot of the young Jeremy when you first started role-playing gaming, like where you were, what was it like, how did you, just a little flavor of that adolescent aspect of it, which is really part of the appeal. Even if you're playing it as an adult, there's something very exuberantly imaginative, not child, but adolescent about it. And so I'd love to hear what your scene was.
Yeah, it is funny that, you know, I've now been playing D&D for, going on more than 3 decades, approaching 4. And it is amazing how when you play, there is still that childlike quality. And it goes back for me when I was about 6 or 7 years old. So this would have been in 1978, 1979, around when the first Player's Handbook came out for D&D. D&D first appeared earlier in the 70s, around 1974, but what we think of as the Player's Handbook showed up around 1978, and that's when my stepsister Amy told me, hey, there's this guy who lived in our apartment complex playing this weird game where you just get to make things up and there are monsters and you cast magic spells. And I was like, sign me up. And so I tried out this game, introduced by my sister. And what's hilarious is for the first year or 2, I had actually no idea this game had any rules. We would just hear one of the other kids, called the Dungeon Master, describing various scenes. You know, you go into this room or into this castle and here are these monsters, and he'd ask us, what do you do? And we would just make it up. So for my initial experience of D&D, this was really just structured make-believe. And so it was kind of a revelation then later when I actually got my hands on rule books and saw, oh my gosh, there's an entire system related to this. And then discovered old books like the early Deities and Demigods, where on top of all the rules, this game was also in a strange way synthesizing various real-world mythologies, making up pantheons of gods on its own, imagining this multiverse of different worlds, many of which sort of represented different subgenres of fantasy, and you could visit all of them. And so really D&D, very early on, was clearly to me not only a game, but really this platform for world creation, for storytelling, and also really a medium for a lot of groups of friends to come together, including our common friend Ben. And one of the earliest things that we did together was play D&D. And I have friends to this day where part of our story as friends are the stories we told together in these imaginative worlds as other people. It's funny, if you play D&D long enough with people, you start thinking of them not only as the person they are, but also as these other persona that they've taken on in the games you've played with them. So like my friend Ben is not only my friend Ben, but I still remember him also as Stephonia, this wily rogue that he played decades ago when we were kids. And so when I see him, I see, oh, there's this other side to you. You know, this hard-as-nails woman who knows how to get what she wants. And so it's like D&D also teases out other sides to people's personalities, sort of the way improvisational acting does.
Yeah, so one of the things that always interested me about it is the balance of the system, the rules, and the imagination. And we tend to think of the imagination in especially in a kind of fantasy sense as a really free flowing a world of, it's like almost a dreamlike world. Anything can happen. There's magic and spells and objects can come alive. And we associate it with kind of this realm of freedom because it's sort of contrasted with our ordinary life, which is so constrained in many ways by systems, by the laws of physics, et cetera, et cetera. And yet D&D creates this real tangible quality to the work of the imagination, precisely by having this balance of rules and storytelling, rules and myth. So it really is in some ways. I mean, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I know you studied. We'll be talking about how you studied religion and mythology and mysticism in a bit. But just the way in which it really, in some ways, is a continuation of something that human beings have done for so long, even if it looks like a sort of weird hybrid of war games and a very modern kind of creation. No one was playing games like this in the 19th century, even though they had dice. In another way, it's a very old practice that we see also in religion and also in actual magical systems and actual mythical systems inside indigenous cultures all around the world, a way of balancing system and whatever it is in the human mind that weaves stories, that it weaves encounters with deity, with enchantment. So it's really kind of a remarkable thing, and it makes sense to me that it would move, in your case, onto when you were a young man of studying religion and becoming more interested in these things. So how did that go? How did you move from a deep immersion in that D&D world into an interest in religion?
So as a teenager and then on into college, I was not only fascinated by fantasy and all of the things that go into, the kind of the wonderful storytelling cauldron that is D&D, but I was also fascinated in real-world myth systems, various religious traditions. There was a summer in college where I was in Moscow for most of the summer and became absolutely fascinated by Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So fascinated that I went on to get my master's degree in theology at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York. It's pretty close to Sarah Lawrence College. And a lot of my study there was on not only the theology of the Eastern churches, but also on mysticism, as well as on Hindu myth and theology. And people sometimes ask me now, how does that study relate to the fact that I now work on this role-playing game? And I often say that study is actually intimately tied to what I do now, because so much of that study is really about the human striving to understand ourselves in the context not only of our own lives, but of this vast cosmos, which we can barely wrap our heads around. And that we often try to gain that understanding through myth-making, through imagining gods, through imagining ways of experiencing the world around us, either through just heightened awareness or through mystical experience, where we can see things with clearer eyes, or if a person is a person of faith, see things, through some kind of divine mystical experience. But whatever a person's perspective, whether, they're a theist, an atheist, an agnostic, there's this hunger for clarified vision, this hunger to see sort of the illusions around us pierced and to see things in a clearer way, and to have a true sense that we are protagonists in our own story, because it's really easy to look at the world around us and see chaos, see confusion, see things we just simply cannot explain, both in our own behavior, in fellow humans' behavior, and also just how the physical world works. And there's this hunger of, I want to actually be the main character in a story that makes sense. And I think a lot of religious and mythological striving is that desire to see meaning, to see sense created. And so it is fascinating to me that D&D, as an entertainment, actually starts to tap into that desire, because D&D is about essentially being this chariot driver. And for some reason, for a lot of the morning, I was thinking about the Bhagavad Gita, this notion of being in a chariot, and if you let go, you can actually let the divine be the chariot driver. But there is ultimately this desire to steer our lives in some way. And in D&D, in this entertainment, you get to be the driver. You have this character where you get to decide what this person does. But what's fascinating is you don't have total control, and this is where the system comes in. You can say, all right, my character is going to try to convince the queen to withdraw her troops from the neighboring kingdom in an effort for us to establish peace. But then you have to roll a die. You have to for a second give yourself over to fate. So even in this entertainment, there's this acknowledgement, just as in the real world, we don't have total control. Now, in the game, that's great because that creates surprise, and that's where there can actually be entertainment. If you had total control over the whole thing, the game really would be just group storytelling, almost like we're writing a novel together. But because there is this system that can, in a way, intrude and create uncertainty, there can be surprise, and again, therefore, this element of fun.
Hey, Jeremy, before we get more back into D&D, I'm just really curious about what was attractive about Eastern Orthodoxy to you? Because I find Eastern Orthodoxy incredibly attractive. It's by far my favorite flavor of Christianity in terms of organized ritual. There's something mystically alive there, and yet at the same time, there's this really alien quality, and some of the sort of positions associated with it are so pre-modern that, you know, they're just impossible to kind of even wrap my head around. And yet I find it a very attractive, fascinating zone. And so I'm curious sort of how you tuned into that particular quality when you were in Moscow and when you were studying theology.
So, well, that's a great question, because there are a number of elements that drew me to it. One of those elements is that ancient, almost inscrutable quality you talk about. Because I always find that the religious traditions that interest me most are the ones that, the way I describe it sometimes, are where the ritual, when I hear it, in some ways is inscrutable the way the babbling of a brook or of a river is. That we don't understand what the river is saying. Yet there's something soothing about it, something ancient, almost this sense of this thing will have a life whether we understand it or not. And so there's kind of almost this ancient authenticity about it that I find appealing. But when it comes to the actual the teachings and whatnot, I was very drawn to the Orthodox tradition's marriage of mysticism, of really trying to see things as they truly are, but also letting go of a lot of our attachments to physical things, our attachments to our misperceptions of ourselves and of the world around us. But that combined with this notion that the body and the physical world around us is ultimately good, and that it is a really interesting marriage, because a lot of mystical traditions tend to, if not demonize the body and the physical world, at least sort of dismiss them. And in the Orthodox tradition, there is this notion that the world around us is if not good, is at least sort of is not fundamentally evil, and that our bodies themselves are a thing to glory in, but that we misperceive ourselves. We misperceive our own consciousness, we misperceive the divine, we misperceive our bodies, and that a lot of it is about aligning ourselves with God and with a truer perception of things. And this is manifested in the Orthodox tradition in its use of icons. If you visited an Orthodox church, you'll see the iconography all over. You'll not only see images of the Christ, but of the saints, And also often of many natural things. You'll see worked into the iconography animals, trees, plants, and whatnot. And the theology of these icons is essentially that properly seen, all of creation is filled with divine light, and that the whole purpose of the Christ, and this is really a formulation of Saint Athanasius, was so that God would become human, so that human could become divine. This notion of theosis, that humanity and the rest of the cosmos could be swept up and viewed properly, could be seen to be filled with a luminousness. And so it's that story, that view of creation, and that view of humanity that I just found utterly fascinating.
Did you consider becoming a monk at any point?
I did, actually. I ended up focusing on an academic track, but I seriously considered for some time following a monastic path. Instead, going down the academic track, I ended up at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, began a PhD program there, but ended up leaving so that the man who is now my husband could then go on and finish his schooling. And I ended up working in editing and whatnot. And, years later, I now find myself working on my favorite game.
Yeah, it's quite an amazing story. Just one other question on the Orthodoxy and the Christianity, when especially from and this is where I know less about the social practice of Eastern Orthodoxy today. Was there a greater tension between being gay and the kind of framework of that religion when you were, thinking like, well, gee, maybe I'm actually going to join this thing, than there is in, now there are there's all sorts of different kind of ways that people who are gay find themselves in a variety of Christian faiths, 100% accepted and happy. Was there more difficulty in that with regarding Eastern Orthodoxy in terms of imagining yourself as being an Orthodox believer and all that?
Yeah, there definitely was some tension. The Orthodox perspective is basically there's nothing wrong with you being gay as long as you don't do anything about it. So for a while, I was still seriously considering a monastic life, and while actually being still out as a gay man, because there was no sense that there was something existentially wrong with me, sort of simply being gay, but the Orthodox Church has not been able to make peace with the fact that then a gay person might go on to actually be in relationship with somebody else. And really, the time when I parted ways with the church was when I ended up with my now husband, Philip, and we've been together for about 18 years now. And Philip is actually Episcopalian, and in the Episcopalian tradition, our relationship is accepted, and so we're able to go to his church and be there as a couple.
Right, and if it's High Church Episcopalian, then you can still get some of that Babbling Brook mumbo jumbo in there.
Yes, no, and it's funny you mentioned that. I went with him to the Easter service recently at the Episcopal Cathedral here in Seattle, and it was a High Church service where they brought out the incense and the bells and all of that. And my God, did I have a powerful sense memory because of all of the Orthodox liturgies I've been to where this incense is used. And it was just the smell for me was more powerful than anything that was said. Because again, it was the sense of being connected to this ancient human hungering for the divine, for greater love, amongst all of us. It was It was like hearing the wind or hearing this river going through. And so at that point for me, it almost didn't matter what was said.
Right, that's wonderful. I love that. Well, since we're talking about discovering oneself and sexual identity and things like that, one way into talking about what you guys did with the fifth edition is to talk about how you re-envisioned and invited people in new ways to create their identities, to create their roles, and the kind of range of options you gave them. And then one of the things, there's a number of shifts you made in the edition in order to, get people back playing the game more and to be playing it in a new way and to be doing it at a time when there's so many other kinds of gaming available. And it seems like one of the things you decided to do was really to kind of beef up the role play and to make it both accessible and as variable as possible. And just sort of, I guess, but to boil it down, it's a very interesting and I have to say tricky time to play with identities, imagined or real, because there's so much pressure on identity politically in terms of, culture wars, Black Lives Matter, everything. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on how you use language around, what kind of identities are possible. And in the multiverse, there's all these ranges. There's different races. There's different, colors within the races. There's different orientations. There's all this stuff. And so there's a lot going on when you come to creating a new map for people to create their roles. And these roles are going to be really significant to them. People often choose the ones that are kind of they're close to one aspect of their personality, and maybe they have another element that's opposite of what they are. And so it's a very, kind of intimate domain in a lot of ways. So what were the things in your head, and what were some of the specific moves you made in terms of creating a new environment for people to create and craft their roles?
So a big part of our vision for the current edition of D&D, 5th edition, was to make what we called the tent as big as possible. D&D among role-playing games has had amazing resilience over the last 40 years, and we believe one of the reasons for that is that it can accommodate so many play styles. Earlier on, you talked about how D&D can include, hack and slash play style where you're just fighting monsters and taking their loot. It can involve intricate story persona as your character. And what we saw, though, is as the game evolved from edition to edition, especially in the previous two editions, 3rd and 4th edition, that as the game was modified for each edition, it began to emphasize a particular style of play over the other styles. And in both of those editions, that style tended to be the more tactical style, where the game emphasized using miniatures on the table more and whatnot, something that many of us enjoy, but something that had really in the past been an optional part of the game. And so when we looked at 5th, we said we want to bring back as many people as possible who enjoyed D&D in its earliest days and keep the people who've loved the more recent editions of the game and bring them all into one big tent. And when we set out on that work, we thought, what is it that unifies all these play styles? What is it that brings the hack and slasher to the table, that brings the immersive role player to the table, that brings the world builder to the table? And we thought, ultimately, it is the opportunity to engage in high heroic fantasy storytelling. And so we wanted to make the game as open-ended as possible and as flexible as possible so that you felt like you had the tools to tell such stories. But then if you wanted, you could also engage in highly tactical play, you can engage in immersive role play, etc. Now, how this relates then to questions of identity, as a part of the game being a big tent, we wanted it also to be as big a tent as possible for as many types of players and as many types of characters. And so we made sure in the 5th edition Player's Handbook, whenever we, in our paintings, depict heroes, we made sure that at least half of them are women. We made sure many of them are people of color. We also then made sure in the material where we talk to you about thinking about the character that you're going to create, that we remind you that your character has a sexual orientation. So your character doesn't have to be straight, you could be gay, you could be asexual, it's your choice. We also want you to think about your character's gender identity. Your character might defy the gender norms for his or her culture. Your character might be trans. And we embed a lot of this talk in the Player's Handbook in the multiverse itself. We talk about the fact that the god of the elves, Corellon, has always been androgynous and can be male or female or neither, depending on the god's whim. And we mentioned that there are especially blessed elves who are made in Corellon's image and are similarly gender fluid. And we did this not only to really drive home how varied the characters can be that you can make. You know, you can not only make a human being of any ethnicity, of either, of any gender identity, of any sexual orientation. You can also, make characters of other species. You can be an elf, you can be a dwarf, etc. But in doing this, we were also signaling to our players that if you are a person who, doesn't feel like you fit into society's gender norms, if you're a person who's, gay or bisexual or asexual, if you in any way are outside the majority, you have a place here in D&D right next to your fellow players who might identify as being part of the majority. In other words, that there is room for all types of players to play all types of characters inside this big tent.
And one of the other things you're doing there, of course, is to pick up our earlier theme, is you're communicating something very true about the history of human mythology and belief systems and culture systems, where there's many cultures even now, but certainly traditional cultures where where gender fluidity was recognized or performed, albeit in different ways than we do it in modernity, but was often associated with shamanic roles, with connections with the gods. That these ideas are not new. This is not like you guys went PC. You actually
yes.
drew off from the history of how humans have thought about spirit and thought about gender in relationship to spirit and to myth, and said, hey, remember, this is what we've always done, and you mix and match it in a new way, in a new modern context, but it's also something that in some ways is very traditional.
Exactly. Yeah, and I love that you bring that up, because I am always mystified when the response to this type of inclusion is that it's some kind of very contemporary, politically correct intrusion. Given my academic background, I view these things as very ancient, because a lot of my early studies were on ancient Greece, for instance. Ancient Greece is always an easy go-to, where in Sparta it was the mightiest warriors were considered possibly to be the ones who were in same-sex relationships, because they would fight most strenuously to keep each other alive. A place where the gods, regardless of their visible gender, were attracted to mortals of either gender. Zeus pursued men and women equally. This idea that the divine is drawn to the mortal in all of its forms. And so again, to me, there's nothing modern about this stuff. It's very ancient. And also, and this is something I often talk about, we have this inclusion in D&D because we actually want our stories to feel authentic, because the real world is even more diverse than the diversity we're depicting in our game. That if we were to really narrow in and depict all of our potential characters as basically white, straight, and mostly male, that would be inauthentic, because that's not what the world around us looks like. And our goal is to give you the tools in the game to tell stories that really resonate and that can also stretch you, because people often come to a game like D&D and want to play a character that is very different from who they are on the outside. You know, there are many men who come to D&D and play women. There are many women who come and play men. There are people who come and play characters of other species. They play characters who have beliefs very different from their own. And we wanted the palette of options available to people when they come here and they look at this game and they ask themselves the question, what persona am I going to adopt in this high heroic adventure? We wanted them to feel like the buffet of options available to them is in many ways limitless.
And you did that partly, and here I'm a little bit on shaky ground because I'm not so familiar with the more recent editions. But did you increase the number of player classes?
So by a count of one, the current Player's Handbook has the largest number of classes available. We have one more class than any of the other Player's Handbooks have had. That said, the classes in the new Player's Handbook are very customizable. And so there is a level of customizability, partly inspired by some of the customizability we had in the 4th edition. The classes in 5th, even once you've picked one, then have additional choices you get to make. If you pick cleric, you then not only pick the god that your cleric serves, but then you also pick sort of the domain of existence that you are emphasizing that pertains to that god. So you might, pick a god who's a god of thunderstorms, and then you decide, well, am I going to focus on the tempest or on war? And then your choice gives you different game capabilities.
And then also, it seemed like that the different classes, like if you're a barbarian or a paladin or a sorcerer, that at some point there are different kind of forms you can, or whatever, archetypes you can sort of follow through. So like the question is like, is your paladin like a holy warrior or more of an avenger type or whatever? So you can kind of refine within a class these different sort of notes of your temperament.
Absolutely. And when we created each of those sub-archetypes, is what we often refer to them among our designers, because each of the classes is basically an archetype, and then we wanted to create sub-archetypes. And our goal for those was not only to give people, game options, cool things they get to do at the game table, but we wanted each of those to be basically another storytelling node. Another way to differentiate your character from other characters. So, take the paladin as one example. Traditionally, going back to 1st edition D&D back in the 70s, the paladin was the classic knight in shining armor, had to have a good alignment, and could even lose his or her powers if the character strayed too far from their oaths to their god or to their holy order. In the current edition now, you can still make a paladin like that. You can still be the classic knight in shining armor. But now we have other options. One of those you mentioned is a paladin who follows the Oath of Vengeance. This is a paladin who is driven less by a drive to be charitable or honorable, and far more driven by a desire to avenge wrongs. And so this character is almost more of like a Batman figure, who is still going to potentially do great good, but might use questionable means to get there. And
one of the wonderful things about D&D for me is just picking up on what you're saying about like the motivation of an avenger as being to right wrongs, is that is that in developing these characters is that you're asked to think of not so much different identities, I mean that too, of a race or class or whatever, but different ethical motivations, which maybe that have shades of gray to them, where you can kind of, relate with them in some ways, but in other ways you have to kind of, role play in order to get inside of the head of that other kind of motivation. And that seems like a really powerful thing, actually, too, because when we're called to be, in our incredibly complex, multidimensional world with so many different identities and types of people and all this sort of stuff, if we're even going to have a hope of empathizing, we can't just go, oh, those people have a right to live too, or they have a space, whatever. You do have to kind of get into people's heads, and one of the ways to do it is to hone in on these different ethical principles that people can seem very bizarre or even wrong headed. And then you kind of realize, oh, wait, but they're motivated by this kind of idea. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, okay. Now I can kind of appreciate where they're coming from. I still might disagree with them. But there is something about that way that you're honing in on the ethics of these characters. And there's so many different ethical orientations that are in the broadest sense and alignments in there. And that seems to be a way in which it really changes people in a kind of interesting way.
Yeah, it is amazing to me how often extended D&D play, I think, can really enhance people's, really their capability to have empathy, because you're playing this person who is not you, similar to, again, what an actor will often go through in performance and in preparation for performance. And if you get inside that character's head, it really forces you to try to see things the way someone else might see them. And it really makes it difficult, if you let that experience sink in, to dismiss the pain that someone else might be feeling or the strange decisions that other people might be making in their lives, because you might have just spent 4 hours with your friends playing D&D, and it's like, wait, we just had to deal with some weird decisions of our own in that game. We captured those goblins, and it might sound silly, saying, well, what was he talking about capturing goblins? But even capturing goblins can result in this sort of an interesting ethical decision. Like, what do we do with them? Do we treat them well? Do we treat them humanely? Do we slay them? Do we think of them as sentient beings like us? It poses kinds of questions that science fiction also often poses in science fiction stories when, humans are confronted by members of other species. And, how do we view the existence of those other species, and how does our view then reflect upon us? What's really interesting when it comes to sort of getting into other people's shoes is to play the role of the dungeon master, the ringleader of the game, the person who's not only adjudicating the rules, but also creating the world that the story takes place in, and then also playing the villains, the friendly characters that the other players' characters meet. I find it particularly fascinating as a dungeon master to get into the minds of the villains that I play, and really try to figure out what is motivating them, what causes them to do all these terrible things. And over the years of playing D&D, many of my favorite characters to create and to get into the minds of are indeed these villains, because it really forces me to consider why fellow human beings would do the sometimes awful things that they do. I don't get to the end of that and then think, I agree with those awful things. But I can at least see a little better how another human might get to doing such a thing. And again, rather than me getting to a spot where it's like, oh, hey, good job for doing that terrible thing, I can at least have this sense of sort of empathic sadness for them, or I start thinking of what can I do in my real life to help the people around me not make the kinds of awful choices the villains are making in the stories I tell.
That's great. I'm thinking we have about 10 minutes left here, and I'm just an interesting question came to my head. where I remember when I was young and I'd come across a Jack Chick religious tract that's about D&D as like a tool of the devil, and there's this sort of sense that when there was all the Christian resistance to rock music and heavy metal, that D&D was often lumped in there. And I remember even as a kid, I was like, well, there's something right about what they're saying, in the sense that it's not just an entertainment, that there really is a way in which the kinds of things that people are doing in D&D are similar to things people are pursuing in religion and in mythology, but also in the occult and the esoteric, and that certainly it served as a gateway for many people, whether in your case towards studying Eastern Orthodox theology, and in other people towards becoming interested in modern occult magic, and other people into indigenous lifeways and shamanism, and any number of ways. And I know lots of people like this. You've known lots of people like this. So obviously, in some ways, this current, which in some ways D&D represents, more than anything, is this kind of continuity with spiritual and religious and mythological impulses that humans have had for centuries, millennia. But in what ways is it different? What is that difference, that kind of thing? Well, no, it's just a game, or it enables you to kind of come close to something, but then also kind of have some playful distance from it. And it's a very tricky thing that says something, I think, very much about where we are now in our modern world with religion, with mythology, with mysticism, where we recognize these currents coming in, the validity of the past, of traditions, and the fact that some people are going to identify with traditions, and that can be great. Maybe we do it ourselves. But there's also something different I think, about where we are in relationship to this part of human mind, part of the human soul. I hope this makes sense to you, because I'm really curious what you think about it.
Well, I think the way in which D&D is very different from actual religious traditions or actual occult practice is, like other games, it allows you to try things out from a safe distance. A simple board game or a strategy game, the classic chess, or many of the other games that are now available, these games allow you to experiment with critical decision-making in a safe environment. Basically, your failure is going to bring no real harm to anybody. And your success, similarly, other than the satisfaction of the success, isn't going to bring, wealth or fame to anybody. So it's like a test bed for decision-making. And I think what D&D really brought to entertainment and recreation is a very similar thing, but not just in the tactical space. D&D still has tactical decision-making when combat starts. You're still practicing critical thinking skills in sort of a padded environment. But then D&D adds on this additional layer of you getting to try on other personas and other beliefs, and also even to step into another reality where where the gods actually might manifest to your character in person. You can, imagine what it would be like to be in this world where, you are a being, like an elf who lives centuries, and who's actually talked to his or her god face to face, and think about, what would that do to my consciousness if I was that character? And so again, it lets us try on belief, persona, other realities, like other games, in this sort of padded, safe environment. It's a place for our imaginations and our spirits to play, and I think in some ways discover really how large we all are on the inside, in terms of our imaginations, our cognitive capabilities, our potential for belief and disbelief, our potential for love, our potential for hatred. It lets us see there is this vast space inside us, this mansion, if you will. I'm now suddenly thinking of the John Crowley novel Little Big, of this idea of everything is, bigger on the inside than on the outside, that like there are vast worlds inside all of us.
Or like the TARDIS.
Yes, exactly, like the TARDIS in Doctor Who. And it's sort of like D&D and other role-playing games invite us to step into this vastness that is inside all of us, but do it in a way that's safe and also in a way that's fun. Because I talked about earlier that the dice mean there's still going to be surprises. The dice also mean absurd things will happen. I've had many games where, as the dungeon master, I've couched things in very sort of Middle Earth terms. I often love, using highfalutin language, and things get very mythological. But yet, a succession of really bad die rolls can quickly push the narrative into the realm of farce, but that to me is a part of the delight of the game. That even then, I always look at that as almost like the fool from King Lear showing up and reminding us of the absurdity of existence. And so even there's an aspect of reality that the game is inviting us to think about, to laugh at, and to get creative about. Because often the best moments in the game is when absurdity rears its head because of weird die rolls. And then the group is challenged to do something with that in the narrative. What the heck does this mean that basically this bookshelf just crashed down on top of me right as I was giving a heroic speech and about to slay the villain? How did what we thought was going to be the climactic battle turn into this comedy scene? And the thing is real life is like that sometimes. Or, the moment we think is going to be happy turns into a tragedy. And again, role-playing games let us experience those things around a table with friends safely. And I think that's a part of their power.
Great. Well, we just got just a few minutes left, and I'd love to hear you say what next we're going to see. What's the next book that's coming out, and what's interesting about that? Give us a teaser.
So we just came out with a book called Curse of Strahd. It is an expansion of an adventure that came out decades ago called Ravenloft. Easily my favorite adventure of all time. It's this gothic horror adventure, heavily inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula, but really it forges its own path. And so Curse of Strahd takes that 32-page adventure from the 80s and expands it into a 256-page book, just filled with all sorts of wonderful gothic horror tidbits. We have coming up a bunch of books, actually, we're working on. At the last count, I think I'm working on 4 books simultaneously right now. But I can't tell you what any of them are, because we always keep our cards very close to our chest. I can tell you safely at least one of them is another big adventure, and our adventures are basically big stories you get to play through. But some of those books are not adventures, and so our fans will have to wait to find out what's in store.
Well, I didn't expect I was going to dig any special data out. I'm familiar with this the hand playing there. Yeah, but Jeremy, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind. It was a really interesting, fascinating talk.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, folks. Next week, what do we got next week? I keep forgetting what we have next week. It's something really good, Anyway, you're going to just have to tune in. Until then, keep your minds open.